So from now on, we are going to start today's forum as hosted by the Office of Government Policy and the Jipyong ESG Center. And the topic is to promote the private sector engagement in development aid and cooperation. I'd like to thank all participants, both on-site and online. My name is Min. I'm a head researcher at the ESG Center at Jipyong. I'm going to be today's moderator. Before we begin today's forum, let me go over today's program briefly. We will first listen to the opening speech, and then VIP guests will take a group photo. After the group photo, we will listen to the keynote speech, and then followed by the two presentations and the two panel discussions. Today's forum is also being streamed live on YouTube channel, and also as per the guidance to prevent the spread of COVID-19, I'd like to ask all the on-site attendees to wear a mask. And then before we begin, I'd like to invite Division Head Han Kyung-pil of the International Development Aid of the Office of Government Policy for the opening remarks. Please welcome him to the podium with a warm applause.
Nice to meet you. Welcome. And I'm going to say a few words after taking my mask off. My name is Kyung-pil Han, Deputy Minister of International Development Cooperation from Office for Government Policy. Good morning. Today, I'm happy to be in a very meaningful event. I welcome all of you to today's event. As you know, Korea joined OECD Development Committee in 2015, and our aid grew from 250 billion to 4 trillion, and we have grown as a middle power. And the reason we were able to grow is because we were able to grow in Korea from a help from the aid, and this was driven by the private sector contribution. And becoming 10th largest economy and becoming an economic export powerhouse is because of aggressive investment from private sector. Nowadays, the global society is facing uncertainties with continued COVID-19 crisis and with war in Ukraine and various disasters coming from climate change is giving us challenges. Developing countries are in an even more dire situation, and even developed countries need to respond to various and even more global issues. This calls for even more role from the private sector in development areas, and we need to increase that cooperation. Korea has the global leading private sector companies with advanced technologies. We believe that these companies can play a catalyst role in facing and overcoming these current challenges. And we are also pursuing global ESG initiatives to protect our society and environment. Advanced countries have long history in development. Through ODA, they have providing good aid to developing countries. Korea is a relatively late follower, and there has been lack of policies and initiatives regarding this. The Korean government, in order to promote ODA participation, we have developed strategy for private sector engagement. And we would like to hear your feedback and contribution on how we can further develop the strategy in detail to translate that into action plan. We hope that today's session becomes a very important session for us to discuss about how we can cooperate and work together. I would also like to ask private sector participants to give us your candid feedback. I would like to thank our presenters and discuss it. And also, I would like to thank ESG's Center at Jipyong for making this event possible. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your wonderful opening remarks. Why don't we give him another round of applause for the opening speech? Thank you very much. Before we invite our keynote speaker, we will first invite the VIP guest to come to the stage for a group photo. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please go back to your seat. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Professor Kim Jong-seok of Graduate School.
Good morning. My name is Jong-seok Kim from Seoul National University. The presentation that I'm going to be talking about is about how private sector engagement contributes to not just development cooperation, but also contribute to private sector players as well. So in light of revitalizing private sector engagement, I would like to talk about how we have had this kind of private sector engagement in the past. This is the agenda for my presentation today. First, I would like to talk about the trend on global ODA PSC. PSC is private sector engagement, and if you look at the trend for PSC, on a high level, it's about donor countries' participation and how that has evolved historically, and also the recipient's development was also the area of focus, or there has been some emphasis on SDG or ESG. So that was at the high level, and that's the high level trend that we're seeing in terms of private sector engagement. So having said that, how have private sector players have contributed in ODA? Traditional areas for contribution were in PPP. PPP is public-private partnerships to provide services to government from the private sector. So BOLT and BLT types of contribution was PPT. It was in the area of power generation, road, hospital, and schools. Also in development cooperation, it's not just about government working together with private sector, which was also regarded as PPP in a broader sense. But one thing that was left out here was the private sector of the receiving countries. So when we say PSD is a private sector development of receiving country. So in order, you have to develop the private sector of the recipient country to develop that developing country. And in order to do that, capability building or sector development were some of the areas that we have worked in. But if you pursue PSD and PSC, which was carried out separately, when you look at the PPP and PSD, it was carried out separately, but by integrating the two, we now have a new concept, which is the PSE, private sector engagement, which invites participation from both donor country and receiving country as well to maximize impact. But here, the receiving country's private sector development is largely led by the private sector of the donor countries. So the private sector for both countries are working together under private sector engagement. Then private sector participation has changed in the last few decades. So in 2010, it was not so long ago, so about 10 or more years ago, what happened was that there were many policies to encourage private sector participation, and it was to build win-win-win relationship. So the recipient country wins, and also the donor country's government wins to contribute to development, and also the private sector participants from donor country also win. So it was the win-win-win relationships. Given that prerequisite, PSE strategy was pursued. Here, the focus was more on private sector participation of the donor country, so there hasn't been large enough emphasis on the recipient country's private sector. But when SDG was development, people started thinking about having institutionalized participation of recipient country's private sector. So the private sector from both countries needed to participate in linkage with SDG. And that concept started to emerge to build self-reliant and sustainable development of the recipient countries. But starting from 2020s, things started to change slightly. One more incentive were added for donor countries' private sector to participate because of the ESG initiatives. So in line with private sector's ESG strategy, private sector can now also further contribute to the development agenda. So solving environmental issues and creating social value are some of the additional value that private sector can bring to the developing agenda. So there is one more added incentive for private sector. But this did not take place in all countries in a uniform way. There has been some differences, but the differences comes from where the focus is. In 2010, the goal was to encourage private sector participation. For instance, in Japan, the focus was to encourage small and mid-sized companies to participate. It did change slightly, but the focus was to provide comprehensive and more integrated support. And when you look at the US, it was based on a market-based approach. So when you look at the US, the focus was to encourage participation from the most competitive companies. So many US companies did participate, but they also set up subsidiaries in local market for participation. But from 2016, even in the US, it was further developed and further systematized to contribute in building self-reliance for the developing countries. The ultimate goal here for U.S. aid is that even if the U.S. support ends, the goal was to have a self-reliance. So recently, there has been some case studies that was developed, and there has been some researches that were carried out around this. Also in the UK, starting from 2010, they have made private sector investment for SDG. So there have been some institutional mechanism to encourage that. And in Canada, starting from 2010, ESG started to become a very important focus. And when carrying out ODA, companies, well, when you look at ESG, ESG is related to SDG 12.6. So they are now focusing on sustainable corporate practice. But when you look at this by different countries, you will find some differences. As I have mentioned, for Japan, Japan encourages Japanese companies to participate. So their goal for private sector engagement is building win-win-win relationship. But they also heavily focused on creating profit and participation from Japanese companies. So having their companies to invest into recipient countries to have sustainable ODA project is something that has been pursued and highlighted in Japan. And when you look at the US, the U.S. Corporations and the local companies were not distinguished heavily, but they focused on private sector participation. But the value that is pursued by ODA and private sector could be different, but they try to find some commonalities. For instance, from the private sector, market expansion would be an important goal, or sustainable profit or long-term profitability is important for private sector. So that would be the business interests. But for development goals, the important agenda would be sustainable livelihood and climate change resilience. So there are some commonalities or common cause that they could pursue. So that would be the opportunity for private sector engagement. So initially, the U.S. For private sector, they didn't distinguish between the private sector in donor country versus recipient countries. But the goal was to build self-reliance. So even if the U.S. companies leave, the impact will be sustained. On the other hand, when you look at Sweden and Australia, when it comes to ODA, they had the most advanced system. So they focused on developing the recipient countries' development to meet the development goal. So as a mechanism or means, they set up challenger funds and it was mostly about helping the Swedish SMEs to go abroad. So they would invest into the recipient countries to meet the development goal and to solve environmental issues.
So there are some examples. Let me take some domestic examples here in Korea. So here you see a program in Vietnam. So this was conducted by a large Korean conglomerate, but it was basically to enhance capacity, and it was carried out by an NGO. And this is actually a good example because it can really empower the local talent, and they will also invest in the local business. But here one characteristic is that the large company, they didn't use their own internal capacity. They kind of outsourced this program to an NGO. So this might sound very natural, but in Korea, actually this is done by many Korean large companies. So because this kind of program, development aid program, is small in size for a large Korean conglomerate to invest their own internal resources. So they typically outsource this kind of program to an NGO. Next, an example is EDCF. This is a PPP program typically. So company will participate and will generate some profit. And this involves a heavy monetary investment. It could be public fund, or it could be the participating private sector company's own fund. And also oftentimes it forms a consortium. So this is a great example. Yet, with this type of program, it is not easy to promote the local companies. Now, let me talk about USAID program in Africa. This is really a massive project that took place in Africa. So it involves like billions of dollars in terms of the investment size, and it was a consortium, and a lot of financing was involved. So this is about building a network, a power network, and a system. So this can really contribute to sustainability and also the environment. And our next example is by Zika, by Japan. So many Japanese companies participate in this kind of development cooperation program, again in the form of a consortium. And many, typically dozens or even hundreds of Japanese companies participate. But one characteristic here is, again, the private sector business of the receiving country is not easy to participate in this kind of program. Now, some European cases, particularly Germany, so GIZ. So this is a developed PPP project. So German companies participate, but they try to build a supply chain specifically for this project, and they try to be eco-friendly. And the participating companies, sorry, I have difficulty reading the print on the screen, and so many German companies participated in this project, and they built a supply chain, an ecosystem as per this project. Next, SIDA, so it's Sweden, Swedish example. So they had a clean off-grid program. A lot of local companies participated for this energy program. So this made a great contribution to building a local ecosystem. in the power sector. So this is a very very consistent with the current trend in the ODA PSE sector. So we briefly looked at some overseas program cases and Korean cases as well. So we analyzed about hundreds of Korean programs and some overseas programs, and we looked at what are the kind of business sectors where these programs are geared towards. Korean programs are geared towards healthcare, IT, but here, depending on the participating company, for example, SMEs, they participate in this kind of program to expand their market overseas. Large corporations, irrespective of their own core capacity, they participate in this kind of program as a part of their CSR activity. So it's not really deeply connected with their core business from the large corporation's perspective. And in terms of building a local ecosystem, or in terms of getting connected with the local businesses, sometimes these are the results of the program, sometimes they are not. So depending on how the program is designed and conducted, it may or may not contribute to building a local business capacity. In the case of Japan, as I mentioned earlier, Japan, GKF runs these kind of PSE programs to promote their domestic companies' overseas business activities. So this is a kind of a snapshot of our analysis of hundreds of domestic programs and some overseas programs. So this is the kind of analysis we have done. Now I want to talk about some policy implications and future development direction for ODA PSE. So we feel the need to promote the private sector development of the recipient country, and also have a program that can pursue co-prosperity or win-win situation of the domestic private sector company as well. So perhaps initially, we can have some kind of institutional framework where many Korean companies can participate in this kind of program. But if we can take one step further, we should be able to promote the private sector of the recipient country. And also, if that is connected with the, for example, ESG strategy or the core capacity of a Korean company from the donor country's perspective, that will be a great direction to take. And also, you can connect this kind of programs, ODA, PSE programs, with the SDGs. SDG has been pursued for a few years now, and particularly a lot of focus is on the environment. So if we can make some kind of connection between ODA, PSE, PSE programs with the SDGs, that will be another great direction to take. Nowadays, every private sector company needs to have their own ESG strategy. So particularly when you go overseas with your business, you really need to think about ESG strategy. So PSE program could be a part of your ESG activities overseas. So for Korean companies' perspective or Korean perspective on PSE strategy, we need to look at the trends, the corporate trends overseas, and also other countries' PSE programs trends. So with this, I'd like to conclude my keynote speech. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Professor Jong-Sub Kim for giving us a good foundation for further discussion. Please give Professor Kim another big round of applause. Then we will move on to the first session of the forum. The first session will be on the PSC strategy to encourage private sector. We will be joined by Junho Meng, Director of Corporations Support under Office of Government Policy. With that, we would like to invite Director Meng for his presentation. Good morning. I am the Director for Corporation Support under the Office of Government Policy. We held the IDC committee last week, and we were able to discuss about the ways to encourage development cooperation for private sector, and discussed about the policy direction to promote development cooperation. The government is seeking strategic engagement and cooperation with the private sector, and this committee signaled that kind of cooperation. Then why government would like to increase cooperation with private sector and development agenda? Many would probably know about the UN SDG agenda, but when you look at the funding resource that is required, because of external shock and externalities, the funding is not enough due to, for instance, COVID-19. When you look at the ODA size, there has been some moderate growth, but it's being stagnant. But when you look at FDI or remittance, compared to ODA, the growth and the magnitude of the size has actually surpassed ODA significantly. So given this trend, the international organization and donor countries are looking into various ways to leverage public fund to invite private fund, and the size has grown threefold over the last few years. Simply put, when you look at the outside of the direct investment and credit line, but when you look at the guarantees and syndicated loans, various of funding mechanism where private sector participation can be accommodated is actually growing significantly. When you look at development cooperation, it was actually mostly driven by the government, but now it is also participated by private sectors and NGOs as well. So many social actors are participating in leveraging their expertise and innovative thought. They pioneer in developing the private sector of recipient or developing countries. And as for when you look at USAID with other organizations, the private sector engagement strategy is being created, and they're announcing it and publishing it to further drive this effort. There has been high volatility in the financial sector. So this is an agenda faced by a lot of the financial industry, but also different investment communities. But if private sector can contribute to environment and society, leveraging ESG framework, we believe that there could be some touch point for public and private sector to work together. The government has made effort to find this touch point with the private sector. There has been public sector cooperation program from KOICA and also PPP program to work with companies under EDCF Korea. And there has been some tangible result. But despite these efforts to date, the proportion of private sector participation, as you can see on the screen, is mostly through ODA, which is through bidding or government procurement. Other method of participation is extremely low, even today. So as I have mentioned in the beginning, the government, in order to promote private sector partnerships, as an incentive, we are developing policy to encourage private sector engagement. And we hope to create create social value and contribute to SDGs through private sector participation. So we have 3 goals and 9 implementation directions. One is to promote private investment and funding support. So providing multi-financing support and making different packages for private sectors. We want to further expand our comprehensive funding, and also we want to promote G2C funding to directly support private sector and diversify our support mechanisms. In addition to that, we will also want to promote impact investment, and various mechanisms are being reviewed at the moment, and we will continue to expand ways for private sector to participate more. So we plan to further supplement and improve the implementation plan. The second ways that we are pursuing this is to expand private sector participation. So bilateral ODA project participation will be increased, and in order to improve this participation, we are helping and developing program to expand different large infra packages business and also link that with a corporate ESG effort. So by developing packaged business, we want to create opportunities for private sector companies to participate. Also, we want to link that with the ESG activities with the companies. So we're continuing to communicate with companies where we can link ODA effort with companies' ESG initiatives. In order to encourage this kind of participation, it is important to expand financial support and ODA environment, but we also need to build an environment for private sector participation. So in that light, building communication channel between private public sector and also enhancing consulting and policy advisory function is something that we're pursuing so that we can share government agenda and also hear feedback from the private sector. So if there are things that we can improve on the government end, we would also like to listen to those feedback to improve. So if we were to promote and activate private sector engagement through these private-public partnerships, we believe each entities can create impact that we are seeking to generate. In conclusion, in 2014, as you see in the picture, the head of DFID made announcement, which was on Smart Aid, and this was announced in London Stock Exchange to promote support for developing countries. And he emphasized generating output for investment and support for developing countries. So this was to, I guess, enhance effectiveness of the investment and help. And from a developed countries standpoint, they're trying to create impact. So when we create strategy and when we have policy directions, it doesn't mean that the impact will be there overnight. Many have been interested in this agenda, but there has been some bottleneck where the public-private sector were not able to further develop their partnerships. So there are some bottlenecks that we need to overcome. So through the discussion that we're going to have after this presentation, we hope to hear more ideas and feedback from the front line so that we can listen to that and reflect that on our policy. So I have briefly introduced about PSC strategy from the government. If you have further interest, please visit our odakorea.go.kr website. You'll be able to have more detailed documentation. And we hope that you have continued interest in this agenda, and we ask for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Once again, let's give Mr. Meng Junho for his wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Now, with this topic of the PSC strategy to promote private sector engagement, we are going to have a panel discussion. So all the panelists, can I ask you to come to the stage and take your seat? Thank you very much. Let me introduce our moderator and the panelists. First, our moderator, Mr. Kwon Yul, the head of Center for International Development Cooperation at GKF, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Mr. Jung Chang-gu from the International Contractors Association of Korea. He is the center head for overseas construction policy support. Mr. Song-young from Korea Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank of Korea. Mr. Lee Sang-baek from KOICA. He has a department for corporate cooperation. Mr. Park Chol-ho from KOTRA. Now, let me hand over the microphone to moderator, Mr. Kwon Yul. Thank you very much. So, regarding the private sector engagement, we are going to have a panel discussion for about 40 minutes. But I believe that we are seeing a diversification of participants in this kind of program, and we are recognizing the importance of the private sector role here. So far, the development aid programs was based on G2G, government-to-government cooperation. But nowadays, private sector players and NGOs are participating as well. So we'd like to hear from each organization represented among our panelists about their own ODA strategy and their future direction. I will first ask Mr. Lee Sang-baek from KOICA. Hello, as introduced, I am Lee Sang-baek. I'm from KOICA. I want to thank the organizers for putting together this important forum so that we can talk about how best to promote private sector participation in ODA programs. Professor Kim and Mr. Meng talked about the ODA trends both in Korea and globally as well. Now, I want to talk about briefly our ODA program direction and strategy at KOICA. I don't need to explain too much about KOICA because many of you are familiar with KOICA. So we run grant programs, and we began private sector participation programs starting 2010. We participated in the Monterey Development Aid Fund. As the previous speaker emphasized the role of a development aid fund, and KOICA also wants to improve the outcome of overall aid program. So we began our private sector participation starting with the 5 major Korean companies, but nowadays we are working with a more diversified private sector participants as well. We heard about the overall strategy for grant programs and aid programs as well. So at KOICA, we are responsible for grant programs. How are we going to increase the magnitude, the size of the programs, and also improve the quality of the programs? At KOICA, regarding our private sector engagement, we want to increase both the quality and quantity as well. In terms of innovation, we want to develop new model for products. So, for example, impact investing or mixed financing. So we try to propose various modalities, and ESG and other important themes. We want to reflect them in our new programs. In terms of the program process, we want to improve the overall process and procedure. So starting May this year, we formed a task force with about 30 participants from private sector companies. So we want to streamline or lessen administrative burden for the participating private sector company. And also, when we pursue projects on a national level or at an international aid organization level, we also want to open ways for the Korean companies to participate in such programs. And we also work with various government agencies and departments as well, agriculture, education, environment. So going forward, we also want to have a kind of integrated or connectivity among these government programs. So this has been a very quick summary of what I work on at KOICA. A private and public partnership is really important, and I hope that today's panel discussion will yield a lot of great ideas to promote private sector engagement in this kind of program. Thank you very much. Thank you. And next, I'd like to invite Mr. Sung-yong, and he is involved in various large-scale infrastructure programs with a lot of private sector participation. So he's going to share with us about that kind of program. As introduced, I'm from the Export-Import Bank of Korea, and as Professor Kim and Dr. Meng mentioned, well, we can actually feel these topics. We have a really first-hand experience of these topics. So EDCF, I want to talk about what we are pursuing, what kind of activities we are pursuing at EDCF, particularly for private sector engagement. EDCF, as you are well aware, we often talk about the Korean government's programs to help other developing countries, but this means that the kind of a program that we provide, we receive the grant that we provide. So here, what we provide is going to be accounted as a liability of the recipient company because they are obligated to pay back to us. So EDCF, this is a bit different from the typical development aid we often think about. So our staff working at EDCF, so we kind of perceive this as financing because here it's not about just giving out money free of charge. It is more like giving a loan to the government, to the country in need. So there are more process and a bigger monetary amount is involved. So the EDCF programs, so there are some programs that are wanted and needed by the recipient country, and we want to focus on this kind of program. And the development finance is not enough, solely looking at the public sector, for example. So the public sector fund alone cannot meet all the demand. In the past, the government would set aside a budget or get a loan from EDCF. So government would actually run this kind of program, and it will be considered as a public sector program. But nowadays, it is more like a private sector program because it means private sector investors are involved, and those investors want to take a profit, return on the investment that they made in this kind of program. And also at the end of the investment, but the outcome, the product of the program belongs to the government. So from the recipient government's perspective, they can build a program without making an upfront investment, but at the end of the program, the outcome, the product of the program belongs to that recipient country government. So the recipient country government prefer this kind of program as well. So
EDCF can support PPP, and they have this commitment to develop projects and implement projects. So that you can find many cases as such, but when you actually look at it, the PPP that was realized, as mentioned by Professor Chung-Sup Kim, there was only the water supply project in Indonesia that was actually realized. So it was the first project where a Korean company went to overseas to provide water source to a major city in the world. In fact, in Indonesia, foreign company to participate and to be successful in winning the bid was actually first of its kind. So it has been done, but it's not that many. So we're trying to do that as well at Exim Bank as well. That's why when Director Meng talked about OGP's effort to expand private sector engagement, we were actually delighted and we welcomed that discussion. And at EDC in August, had a forum. And we escalated that agenda to have the funding during the fund committee. So the purpose of doing that is we want to develop mega projects. When projects become bigger in scale, the government alone cannot cover that project. So we have no choice but to engage private sector. And if Korean companies have more opportunity to participate in such a private sector engagement, we're working, that would be good for us. So we are making effort to grow the size of the project. So we have signed a framework arrangement (FA) with Suwon government. So what this is a loan agreement. So we have to make that agreement case by case, but it takes time and there's a long lead time. So it could take as much as 3 years or 5 years. So during 3 or 5 years, what we do is we commit for that investment for the recipient country. So FA would be around 100, 300, or even $1 billion. So the size of FA size, which was up to $1 billion. So to build a sizable infrastructure, and for those countries who can build that kind of sizable infrastructure, we can go as high as 2 billion or up to 4 billion. So we are planning to increase FA amount to up to $4 billion to encourage mega project for recipient countries. EDCF, from an age standpoint, it does look bigger in size, but when you look at the overall infrastructure size, EDCF itself is relatively small as well. So when you look at it and in comparison to Exim's other fund like EDPF or export funding, I mean, we can even link this EDCF fund with other funds within Exim. It can even grow more in size. So we have developed some strategy around that. One other important phase for infrastructure project is you need to identify this project and prepare for this project. So in a nutshell, the deal sourcing process is critical. So deal sourcing to identify and develop project. In the past, EDCF worked directly with the developing country's government. But as Mr. Lee mentioned, there are different types of networks that we can leverage. There could be KOICA and other aid organizations that provide grants. And we can also even work with ADB, ADBF, or MDBs. So enhancing cooperation with these different organizations is something that we have in the pipeline. Last but not least, what we think is important is that EDCF, until today, and when you look at, I mean, we did support a lot of PPP in the past, but when you look at the debtor, they are mostly the public organization. So we want to expand the debtor pool to the private sector as well. We believe this is diversifying business. So we not just provide loan, but also provide guarantees and equity investment as well. So that's in the plan. And for these plans to generate visible impact, then I think Korean companies can go to market in developing countries, and we believe that EDCF can provide the role of strong support for our companies. Thank you for that comment. So KOICA is the lead organization for EDCF. So I would believe KOICA will play an important role in promoting participation for private sector. Now we have with us there has been some lot of corporate support for that was provided by KOICA. So going beyond corporate support, we also want to increase development cooperation. So at KOTRA, can you please introduce some of the programs that you're implementing today? And Mr. Chol-ho Park, could you please tell us more about partner institutions? So identifying and developing good partners is important. So what is KOTRA doing in terms of those kind of initiatives? Good morning. My name is Choro Kim from KOTRA. I am the team lead for Development Cooperation. As you know, that KOTRA have 127 offices in 83 countries. So we invite investment and we help companies to go abroad. In the area of development cooperation, we started this effort with KSP in 2013. And as Mr. Kwon mentioned, we have expanded to CSR as well. So Korean companies use CSR to develop markets, and they also enhance their company reputation and awareness in the market through CSR as well. So what I would like to cover today is I want to talk about my lessons learned when I was abroad, and including OGP, KOICA is working with government to carry out various programs. So let me please introduce those programs. First, Professor Kim talked about PSC strategy and PSC area. And recently, as he mentioned, private and public sector have different interests, inevitably. So even when government thinks it's a good project, private sector can think otherwise, and vice versa as well. Because government sometimes can question the effectiveness of the project, even if the private sector thinks it's a good project. So we are now working with Ministry, MOSF, to select private sector project. And we have registered 59 projects through some 5 dozen companies to select different projects. And the projects that are in urgency will start next year. So from a proposal stage, what we do is we target those areas where private sector is interested in, and from very early on, we would engage private sector to participate in government projects, so that we link private sector interest to government project. We started PSC projects since 2004, and now that has been expanded into ESG area. So not just in the area of social corporate responsibilities, but going further to environment and social issues. What we are doing is we're targeting companies who are committed to contribute to environment and society to participate. So we identify local players and we help with the transportation and logistics. So every year we support about 130 companies annually. And lastly, what I want to mention is that nowadays, in order to promote private sector engagement, like I said, we can also review this from a very initial stage, but also by different stages, private sector can be invited in the process as well. So KSP is one example. Although KSP is a very small part of ODA, when we look at the commitment of the recipient country and look at the willingness of the country, recipient country, to look at KSF feasibility. So if the feasibility is there, and we created EIPP, Economic Innovation Partnership Program recently. So we provide 10 KSP to one single country. And in the final stage, we support until that they can proceed into a pre-FS state. So whether it be EDCF or whether it be ODA, we are trying to link this pre-FS to next level of funding as well. As far as I know, OGP, Director Meng did mention this in his presentation, but this is also mentioned as a package project or package program as well. So, in conclusion, when it comes to PSE, private sector engagement, we do need to start from the private sector interest, and from the area of PSD, I mean, our local Korean companies are pursuing CSR and ESG, so we need to also locally support that, and that will be ideal way to engage them. And also it will be helpful to create channel of communication as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Jung Chang-gu from the International Contractors Association of Korea. So the International Contractors Association of Korea is actually designated for overseas construction programs, for example, infrastructure and the PPP programs, and they know what kind of companies are active participants in these programs. So Mr. Jung. So as introduced, I am Jung Chang-gu from the International Contractors Association of Korea. So basically, we support companies that want to go overseas for the construction business. And starting last year, we became the ODA agency for the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transportation. And also, we are designated for various overseas construction programs. And for example, we provide the PSP finance to private sector companies, and we provide OJT trainings for expats. For the employees, Korean construction companies employees who are dispatched overseas for these programs. I really enjoyed Professor Kim's presentation, and we think about how to promote private sector participation in overseas construction programs. Private sector to promote private sector participation in overseas construction programs, as the Kotra representative mentioned, we need to think about there is a gap between the project thought by the government and the project that's wanted by the private sector companies. So, for example, perhaps we can have a kind of a co-financing so that, or to accommodate that gap. And also, as many of us here mentioned, when Korean companies go overseas for this kind of ODA program, it doesn't end just being a one-time program. Sometimes localization is needed, and participating companies have localization strategy, and they are building local network, and they want to build such local network. And also, if in terms of the PSE from the recipient country's perspective, if you look at the Middle East or India or other Asian countries, they emphasize localization. These recipient countries emphasize localization. So, for example, when a Korean company wants to win their local project, there's a requirement for local human resource of a certain percentage or local content of certain percentage. So these kind of requirements from the recipient governments is becoming common and even expanding. So when Korean companies go overseas for this kind of ODA programs, it is wrong to think that you can conduct this program with only Korean contents, with only Korean people. So, for private sector company to go overseas, they need to work with a local company and local content, and also EDPF, or if they get other financing support. It's still very difficult to meet all the financing needs of a massive infrastructure program. Private sector can provide a much bigger financing support, so private sector needs to definitely be in, and SWF, Sovereign Wealth Fund, and pension funds also need to participate as well. Otherwise, private sector financing may not be so eager to participate in this kind of ODA massive construction program. JICA was very active in Thailand, for example, but the local financing companies in Thailand, they participated in these JICA programs as well. So we can take a cue from this. So many domestic Korean financing companies, for example, securities firms, if we give an opportunity for them to participate in this kind of overseas construction programs, so that will be great. If you look at one case in Vietnam, they actually revised the law on PPP. So major countries are now revising PPP law. Almost it's like a competition. So because ODA size are typically too small to accommodate the entire financing needs of an infrastructure program. So you need a bigger funding. To do that, many countries now feel the need to revise PPP law. So Vietnam is one country, so they are pursuing legal revision. So it's clear that if you think of getting financing only from an ODA program, you cannot really meet all the financing needs of an overseas construction program. MDBs and private sector, I really want to emphasize MDB and private sector as well. And for example, USAID, USIFC, and Korea, we recently launched a kind, or other DeFis are being discussed. So all these development cooperation aims, they could provide financing in a tied format. Even though it might look untied superficially, but sometimes you need to have some tied element for the financing in order to promote active participation of private sector construction companies. And there are various funds in Korea as well, yet many Korean companies are still commenting that EDPF funding is very difficult to win, and the funding size is still too small. So definitely there is a room for improvement. And lastly, regarding the support strategy for ODA related programs, for example, KOICA. So when a private sector makes a proposal for this kind of ODA program, when you give FS funding, then perhaps there needs to be some incentives to promote private sector proposals and participation. I have many more comments to make actually, but at the end of the day, the government needs to recognize that when private sector companies goes into these kind of less developed countries, they are taking some sort of risk. So the government needs to recognize that and also find the way to promote their participation by providing more support.
Thank you very much for that discussion. So we have about 4 minutes left. Professor Kim and Director Meng already made a presentation, so we're joined by these two presenters as well. So we are now open for question. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation. Based on all the discussions and presentation, if you have any comments or question, please let us know. Private sector engagement to date has been somewhat passively discussed, because when you look at ODA itself, ODA was targeted for not just short-term impact, but it's for long or mid to long-term development. So that's why the engagement was rather limited. But in order to enhance development effectiveness, not just aid effectiveness, the private and public sector cooperation becomes all the more important, and various process and approach needs to be improved as well. So we were able to hear a lot of good ideas. It seems that we also are left with many homeworks as well. So it's not just about government projects, but we need to have public-private cooperation to increase effectiveness. And we also need to share roles and responsibilities as well. Personally, depending on private sector engagement, we can anticipate some impact, but there is also risk that needs to be shared between public and private sector. The government, going beyond just government guarantee and doing equity investment and investment approach needs to be diversified so that we can further encourage more participation. Since there's no further question, there's a question in the back. Please go ahead. Can you hear me? I'm going to take off my mask for a while. My name is Sungman Mi. I lead one of the ICT organization. We have been an ICT engineering company for the last 30 years. we have carried out all the projects that are issued by the project owner on the stage today. And we're actually pursuing some of the projects even today. In order to promote private sector engagement, I would like to first of all thank you for making this forum so that we can also talk about this important issue. We have about 35 consultants. We have about 300 employees, but we also have expert consultants. Of course, I don't have enough time to talk about all the challenges, but I want to end with a positive message. We are very much interested in EIPP project. As a single company, there are many challenges to carry out overseas projects, especially for middle companies like us. It is almost impossible. So we need government support and public support, public institution support to successfully carry out this kind of projects. Therefore, PIPP program is very timely and needed. And whenever we go into overseas project, it ends as a one-time initiative, and sometimes it's not sustainable. Although many of the projects are linked together and is sustainable, we're unable to participate in that kind of continued project. So we get support from KOTRA and KOTRA's office overseas. But when you look at different procedures in a project like build, operate, and proposal, often it ends in one stage and it's not continued and linked to the next stage. So without government support and good mechanisms and institution, it's very difficult to continue on to the next stage after one project is offered, after it's finished. So as a private entity, we have to generate profit. So for a company, it's very difficult to take that profit model or business model to continue on with this kind of business. So we often give up. Although I'm a CEO, I've always thought about stopping or quitting in the middle, but based on accumulated experience and with heightened interest from the government and government support, I am rather hopeful. So now I still keep and have my 30 consultants for this business. So when there is a project opportunity, for instance, KOTRA, if there is a project by ISAC supported by KOTRA in PS area, if we can share the impact from the result, actually the deliverables are shared, but sometimes it is not. So I know I don't have enough time, so in the interest of time, I just want to express that EIPP project can continue after stage. So we hope that we can continue to participate in the whole life cycle of the EIPP project. Thank you for listening. Thank you. We were able to hear about the frontline feedback. So from a government standpoint, government is looking into a strategic project development from planning to actual implementation so that the project is sustainable. They're also looking into packaging this kind of project so that we take mid to long-term view in identifying different projects, and that is something that is urgent in terms of the government agenda. So based on what we have discussed today in this forum, we hope that these feedback and discussion can contribute to future policy and future implementation. I would like to thank everyone for their presentation and discussion. With that, we wrap up our session. Thank you. We would like to invite another big round of applause for our 5 participants on stage. With that, we end our first session for Revitalizing Private Sector Engagement in Development Cooperation. Next, we would like to talk under the topic of ESG and Development Cooperation. With that, I would like to invite Junik Lee, Center Head of ESG at Jipyong, and he will be presenting on the topic. The topic will be about the Korean company's case and how we will link this to private sector engagement.
Good morning. As introduced, I'm Lee Jun-hee. I am given only 10 minutes, so I'd love to talk more about development cooperation, but I will be brief in my talk, but you can refer to my slides. I looked at Korean companies' participation in terms of ESG management and development cooperation. So I hope that I can give you a brief explanation. And with that, perhaps you can think about how better to improve the effectiveness of Korea's ODA programs and how to connect that with our PSE as well. So this is kind of a trend that we were able to analyze at our company. So if you Google ESG, you can see that ESG interest, Korea's interest in ESG grew a lot after 2020. But if you Google SDG, so globally, the interest goes up steadily along with interest in ESG. The global interest in SDG increased a lot, but it's even more dramatic for Korea as well. So a lot of Korean companies are working hard to develop ESG strategy, but Korea's interest in SDG is far behind compared to Korea's interest in ESG. So this is kind of an imbalance in Korean people's perception. So we want to find a way to resolve this. And why am I bringing this up? So I want to talk about what kind of private sector companies in what kind of industries are participating in ESG management. Because with that understanding, we need to build a framework for ESG. So over 90% of companies in Korea are actually SME, small and medium-sized companies, by various metrics, for example, the number of employees. And ESG is a kind of a concept that came from EU and Europe and US, and more regulations are coming from Europe and the US. So this is kind of a global issue at the moment rather than a domestic Korean issue. And Korean economy, a lot of portion goes to the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing inevitably produces carbon emission. So ESG is definitely important for the Korean economy to deal with. So we need to think about how to resolve the carbon emission issue, and at the same time to win overseas export market. So ESG is an important aspect for Korean companies. So we need to think about ESG in the context of the corporate management and business in Korea. Let me briefly go over the history of ESG in Korea. So the ESG, the concept of ESG has been around for about 20 years. With a strong globalization in 2000, now EHS became an important topic for Korean companies, but it was more focused on safe work environment and sustainable management as well. But about 2015, now there is a big understanding about corporate social responsibilities and ESGs and other social values as well. And after COVID-19, large sovereign wealth fund and pension funds, they are now demanding ESG values to be reflected in corporate management. So companies now, because of this demand from the investors, companies also are aware of the importance of these values and not just the financial values. So companies are now being measured not just by their financial performance, but by their non-financial performance in the ESG area. So given this kind of backdrop, ODA can definitely give value to companies as a way to practice ESG values. So recently, established companies are more participating in ESG activities. Established companies are now growing fast in size, so they have more financial resources to dedicate to ESG. Financial companies and financial groups, of course, they need to participate in overseas development aid programs, particularly ESG. But if we can come up with ways to invite overall companies of various sectors, it will be really desirable direction. Now I want to talk about some industry of private sector companies participating in ODA programs. So we can see the characteristics of the overall private sector companies in Korea. For example, governance and good governance and transparency and companies who are doing well in governance and transparency, they also tend to participate in ODA programs as well. And they also think about values such as inclusivity for the local community, diversity, etc. So when a company wants to go into a certain country, or if they think about their certain global work site, they want to know what kind of impact their business activities have on the ESG aspect. So they want to discover good business practices and programs that can promote ESG values as they conduct business activities. So that will be a great way to invite more private sector companies in the ESG areas. The same goes for the financial companies as well. Financial companies, they also have a lot to think about because their products is not physical products, it's a financial services and financial products. So they can more directly participate in, for example, inclusive finance, another ESG type of program. So these are some ESG area, and if you have an ODA program with both public and private participation in these areas, we can think about how to have a success case. And we looked at some sustainability report put forward by companies. We can see some characteristics of these companies. If you look at Korean companies working overseas, for example, in Vietnam, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asia, and these Asian countries are also our ODA recipient companies. Their activities are geared towards a short-term contributions, but if they also want to have strategic business for long term in these areas. But they kind of participate in these markets with ODA or ESG activities for more short term corporate social responsibility activities. But if we can make a connection between ESG values and ODA and the company's overall long term business, then it will be a better direction to take. And these are some data that we also analyzed per various projects. If you look at Korean private sector companies' ODA programs overseas, so these are some of the examples. So we built a bottom-up DB database, and going forward, we can have a better platform so that companies can participate in a kind of platform of ODA programs, and they can have a better visibility on the data of the ODA programs where Korean companies are participating in. And so we also looked at Korean companies' global business in developing countries. You can see there are a lot of financial companies are participating, and some industrial companies and some consumable business as well. And climate action recently, or EV, battery, and these are some specific areas for business. We heard a lot about these kind of programs already. But at the end of these programs, we want to improve the local capability, and we want to build a local network and ecosystem. And companies, they have their own objectives, business objectives. So they want to see more market opportunities at the end of this kind of activities as well. And when we look at Korean companies' data, if you look at type 1, 2, 3, these are kind of typical. So if we make more linkage between their overseas ESG management practices and ODA programs, that will be better. And if you look at type 2 and type 3, how are we going to promote that to type 1? And how we can promote more success cases among Korean private sector companies, that will be great too. So in conclusion, so this conclusion is similar to professor who made a talk earlier. So we still have a low level of awareness of the PSD overall in Korea, and we need to also improve the public awareness of PSE as well. So on this note, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Once again, please give a warm hand to Junhee Lee for her presentation. Following the presentation, we're going to have a discussion, a panel discussion, under the topic of ESG and private sector participation. So I would like to invite our discussant onto the stage. Let me please introduce our discussant. The chairman of the discussion will be the EVP of Korea Institute for Development Strategy, Hong Min-jeon, and we have team leader Se-won Kim joining us from Hyundai Construction, and we also have team leader Young-ju Lee from Isu Chemicals. And we have with us a team leader from SK Ecoplant, Se-yoon Song. And last but not least, we have with us the president of Korea Social Investment Foundation, SIF, Sun-yeol Lee. And with that, the mic is yours, Chairman. My name is Hong Min-jeon from KDS. As the first presentation, we were able to hear from our keynote speaker as well as speakers from first section and second section. So public sector is making a lot of effort to engage private sector. However, private sector is participating as part of CSR activities, and it takes time for them to improve or take the journey from CSR to ESG. But when you look at our panelists today, they're quite an outlier in the area of ESG because they have really stood out in linking their ESG effort with development cooperation, and we were able to also invite institutions that carries out extensive impact investment in Korea as well. So before we start our discussion, I would like to hear about ESG strategy in each and every organization on stage. And ESG, to an extent, has developed around many of the domestic stakeholders. But if we were to expand to overseas, especially in developing countries, especially making that link with development cooperation, what kind of opportunities do we have in carrying out this kind of development cooperation? So we would like to hear your insight on that. So first, I would like to give the microphone to Sewon Kim from Hyundai. I looked at your sustainability report, and you had 4P: prosperity, planet, people, and profitability. So 4P was your sustainability strategy, looking at your sustainability report. So I would like to invite you to speak about Hyundai's strategy. Good morning. I am in charge of sustainability team at Hyundai CNT. I would like to thank you for your invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak. And as you have mentioned, as our chair has mentioned, we are present in many overseas markets, and we are doing many of the B2B business. And we work extensively with Exim Bank, KOICA, as well as ISAC as well, ICAK as well. So we're currently engaging in many partnerships with these institutions. ESG, when it look at the guidelines, there are some directions set forth by the US and Europe on how humanities should move forward, and also sustainability agenda is in that guideline. But when it comes to partnerships and localization, ESG and localization strategy has some gap to fill, as you know. When it comes to carbon neutrality or COP, when you look at the COP result, you can probably feel for what I'm getting at. Because we're doing a lot of overseas development, we want to bridge the local situation with future directions. So we're seeking many local efforts and partnerships in this regard. Developing countries need to understand the ESG concept, and they need to be aligned on what we're trying to achieve in ESG and where we're heading. So that's something that we need to establish. When it comes to Korea, and when you look at the US and European market, there has been some alignment, and government policy and corporate policy have same direction, and it's fully aligned. But when it comes to developing countries, the alignment is not quite there yet. So we have some work to do there. So when it comes to policy drive, and when it comes to value alignment and value engagement, this is something that we need to expand and grow in the future. With that, I would like to end my introduction. Thank you very much. Following this comment, I would like to invite Youngju Lee from Isu Chemical. My question to you is that Isu Chemical, starting this year, started ESG management. And you're implementing 3I: innovation, impact, and integrity. So you have ESG strategy around these 3 I's. So basically, I would like to hear about your strategic directions and what you're actually doing in your company, and what are some of the touch points with development cooperation. Good morning. My name is Youngju Lee. I'm responsible for planning strategy at Isu Chemical. Our chair said that we are some of the outliers, but Isu Chemical just started ESG efforts, so we are at a rather early stage. So we are a middle-sized company, just merely starting ESG effort. To briefly introduce our company, we started our business with LAB, which is the detergent ingredient, and we're doing in various ingredient and green bio business as well. We have about 450 employees, and we are a mid company in Korea. When it comes to ESG effort, We are just developing ESG strategy and plan, and in the midst of implementing this implementation. And we are also engaging in batteries as well as green environmentally friendly business as well. And we have acquired a subsidiary company for green bio business, and it's a greenhouse builder. So we have started ODA in Cambodia. So I would like to share about some of the challenges that we're facing in this business later on. Thank you very much for that comment. Next, I would like to invite SK Eco Plant. Waste zero, net zero, is their ESG strategy to process environment waste, and they are doing many initiatives around circular economy. So we would like to understand further about how you're institutionalizing and embedding ESG in SK Eco Plant. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Se-Yun Song from SK Eco Plant. Let me briefly introduce our company. 2 years ago, we acquired EMC, which is the #1 environment eco platform in Korea. So we selected environment as a next generation growth engine. So we changed our name to SK Eco Plant from SK Construction Company. So we are evolving around 2 pillars, which is new business and environment. Since 2 years ago, we have published our sustainability report on our website. We are not a listed company yet, but as an unlisted company still, our management believed that ESG is an important agenda, so we are also disclosing all our information. Our company, before changing business model, we engaged in PPP project, and we're doing in Eurasia Tunnel and Tanakola Bridge are some of the project that we have started in PPP. But after changing business model, we now think about going to developing countries to contribute to their environment.
So to give you some examples, in the past, for the least developed countries, they didn't have a national budget. They didn't have like national technology, their own technology. They didn't have a legal framework. So because of that, environmental infrastructure was very lacking, and if there is a heavy rain, the rain will just go underground, and it will be not really drinkable water for people. So for this kind of area, the private sector was not able to enter. But nowadays, due to the many actions to deal with the climate change, now we have this new concept of a carbon credit. So now we can trade a carbon credit certificate. So this can really generate revenue. So in the country that you make an investment in, depending on the country's credit rating level, we can find a way to recover our investment. So right now, not everything is in place, but now there is a way opening up because you can trade carbon credit. So nowadays, the least developed countries' level of infrastructure or level of technology, these are becoming less important. So definitely more opportunities for companies like us to go into least developed countries for various projects. Thank you very much. And now also in Korea, we have the Korea Social Investment Foundation, and they are also an accelerator, but also they began ESG partnership programs as well. So I'd like to invite Ms. Lee Sun-yeol from Korea Social Investment Foundation. So just like our name says it, we want to make investments that can make the Korean society a better society. Particularly, we want to invest in the areas where we can improve ESG values. But I want to talk about startup ecosystem as well, because we are an accelerator. So for startups, the ESG is a kind of ESG is a big change in the business environment. So they have to think about how to incorporate ESG values in their business, and what kind of actual social issues can be resolved by their business, particularly in Singapore or the US, or when they go into developing countries for business. Now startups are held to a much higher bar in terms of these social impact. So they need to think about how to develop a strategy for that, and that's my role. So as an accelerator, we need to help startups to come up with ESG strategies and how to cooperate ESG into their business. So the business model that we are considering is partnership or cooperation between startup and large companies in the area of ESG. So emerging markets, that's our word for developing countries. It could be Vietnam or India. So we want to also boost up the ESG of large companies in these emerging countries. And also we want to help Korean companies to meet the carbon emission related target. So basically, we want to help large Korean companies to improve their ESG practices, and Korean large conglomerates, when they go overseas, they want to create some social impact locally, and in terms of development cooperation, they also want to produce some outcome. That way, they need to work with the local companies, local agencies, for example. So we support these kind of efforts, and also we want to help the local startups to work with the local government as well to boost up ESG values. So, and also some donor agencies in Korea, we believe that they can play the facilitator role in boosting up ESG values in recipient countries. So whether it is a recipient country, donor country, basically we want to help to build an ecosystem between startups and large companies for more sustainable business. And I hope that basically startup companies and Korean companies, they want to continue to function as a business on a sustainable business. So with these ESG or ODA programs, we want to build this kind of structure or lay the foundation to enable this. Thank you very much. Thank you. For the second round of discussion, my question is, actually, I want to hear more about some specific cases for your organization. Perhaps you participated in a program for procurement or ESG cooperative program, perhaps with KOICA or some other program, and perhaps a PPP. So perhaps you work with a Korean Financial Institute or guarantor in Korea for financing. So usually the private public sector partnerships start very well with great enthusiasm, but in the process you find a lot of challenges and things to improve. And this is the case not just for the public sector, but also for the private sector as well. So private sector companies also probably found out what they need to change. For example, construction company in the past, they used to participate more in procurement market, but now they're participating in investment market. So construction companies, however, cannot take all the investment risk themselves. So any great examples of development program that you participated from Hyundai ENC? from our perspective, so we make a bidding for pre-qualification for recipient company. So basically, we're competing against the other large-scale construction companies to have business in a third-party country. The recent trends that we are witnessing, just about 10 years ago, Korean companies had definitely international competitiveness. So before the developing countries achieved a certain level of development, the pre-qualification or before other countries, companies would enter into these countries, and before financing risk was much less pronounced. So in these past days, we began participating in this kind of program, and we learned some lessons, and also Korean companies. So we realized that we are competing against Indian companies, Turkish companies, and Chinese companies, and we don't have a much pronounced superior competitiveness compared to these other countries' companies. So definitely we can see more diversification in overseas development projects. And as a Korean company, when we go overseas, it is now much more challenging compared to in the past. I think this is what everyone knows nowadays. Given that many policy makers and private sector people, we not need to think about more diverse policy support and paradigm shift as well. I want to talk about financial resources. So again, we don't have enough financial resources for Korea, from Korea's perspective. But China, they have more financial resources. When we compete against the other nationality companies, they have a lot of financial resources. So they have certain structure to allow a concentration of financial resources. So that's what we are competing against overseas. And in terms of policy consistency and diversity as well. For example, in Korea, ODA and PPA program, we kind of have a long-term perspective, like over 10 years. But sometimes policy changes in the middle of the project, and the budget changes as well. So we are dealing with a multi-year project. Sometimes a policy consistency is lacking in the midst of an ongoing project. If you look at Japan or China, when we were competing against them, they definitely had more competitiveness in these regards. So we need to improve on this.
And also, in case of ODA, Hyundai KOICA Response Center was set up in 2010, and we have carried out multi-year project with KOICA. So we had one project case where we did a multi-year project. So we were able to see both ODA case and USE's case as well. So we provided a vocational training center, and then we have created the first training program for government and academia. And we worked with Hyundai motor companies. But when you look at local curriculum versus Korean curriculum, there has been some differences and gap in curriculum because of differences in policy. For instance, for USG component, we looked into the industrial safety area in Vietnam. But as you know, when you look at developing countries or emerging countries, there is somewhat a little shallow depth when it comes to humanism safety concept. So in order to build alignment, we carried out some alignment in vocational training. But there has been some differences coming from cultural differences and policy differences. as well as approval procedure differences as well. So that's something that we can work together to improve in the next round. When it comes to large or mid or small and medium-sized enterprises, but for ESG, the risk management for supply chain management or supply chain is very important. So vendor management and supply chain management, and medical, mineral, and raw material management will be critical. So aligning different policies and providing policy support is something that we need in the mid to long-term initiatives. That will be important in building stronger network with developing countries. When we get EU or US financing, and for tier 1 contractor, ESG or carbon emission and RE 100 requirement will be applied. So doing supply chain due diligence and human resource networking and network due diligence is carried out, and that's also going to be helpful to prepare in advance. Isu Chemical recently got into solid battery business and smart farm business, which is something that we need for the developing countries. And you're also doing remote area development for Cambodia as well. Could you please introduce these cases? So regarding green bio business, if I may add, and then I would like to also then go into Cambodia ODA business. We provide smart farm construction, so we go from design to installation, and also we carry out training for this farming. And we work in a 5-hectare smart farm in China, and we're actually building and operating that smart farm. And Hanggaran Phanex, our subsidiary, is a SME companies which carried out Cambodia ODA business. So I'm going to talk about our lessons learned. Smart farm is about IT technologies, or using advanced technologies. We are increasing productivity and growing crops within greenhouse to limit the different barriers coming from climate and weather. But when you look at internet connection and power connection in the developing countries, there are some limitations. So in order to support smart farm business, we were able to go into ODA through smart farm, but we don't have the right infrastructure to run and operate smart farm. So we did install this smart farm, but then it ended there. So from our company standpoint, if we had the internet connection, and in order to overcome that connection problem and power problem, we are currently reviewing ways to provide independent power generation for that site. But although while we will review this, but once we set up that kind of power generation, when you look at SMEs or middle companies, we are going into those markets to grow the business, but there are some improvement needed in terms of generating profitability and monetizing it. So if you look at how we can improve this, if we can link this and plan this together with large enterprises in Korea, it could have been much better. So that's something that I believe as a lesson that we can improve in the future. So when you look at the panel discussion today and presentation today, I was able to realize that many are already working in this area. So as a middle company, I am hopeful that we'll be able to get policy support in the future. Thank you very much for that discussion. SK Eco Plant also mentioned about environmentally friendly and creating a circular economy as well. So from end-to-end or building end-to-end solution is something that you have in the plan. So I'm sure you have some touch point with emerging economies. So do you have any lessons learned or some of the challenges that you faced? Well, this May, we acquired 30% of equity of Stenbio company in Malaysia. And using that as an anchor point, we want to expand to Southeast Asia. And what we're doing today is, of course, I cannot go into the details about development, but when we compare ourselves with peer, when it comes to landfill, so methane gas from landfill can be collected and then burned to get ETS. So methane has 21 times higher emission impact, so it's registered in UNSC. So it improves the environment for overseas market, but we also contribute to the environment. The West KEPCO is doing that in Myanmar, and there's also a project going on in Mongolia. So we are also not only going into Southeast Asia, but also we are targeting Latin America as a prospect. But it's not just landfill, but sludge from wastewater and sewage are the areas that we're working on. So we want to contribute to the environment in Southeast Asia, and we also want to create profit. So we are working hard to create this double benefit. Thank you very much for that comment. Then the Korea Social Investment Foundation, SIF, made a very good recommendation. But I believe financing and funding is also very important for private sector engagement. Impact investment cannot cover everything, but can play a critical role. So do you have anything to add? First of all, let me talk about some cases. We have people from KOICA as well, but KOICA has many social ventures and startup ventures and help them go into developing countries to expand their business. So they're currently carrying out these businesses, and our team meet with 10 startup companies every year to help them go into developing countries. And using ODA fund, startup companies and social companies can build their foundation and then launch their business. So this kind of support from KOICA is extremely helpful. But based on this kind of support, when these startup companies carry out and implement their business strategy, they have to build and approach this from zero base. For instance, there is a startup called Ruby Lab, and they scan food. So just scanning food itself can weigh the food and then measure ingredients there. So it's an AI-based service. And they went to Vietnam. They wanted to go to Vietnam as a healthcare solution. But then in Vietnam, there is no cafeteria in school. Many students still bring home lunch boxes. So food scanning as a healthcare solution for children was not fit for the market. So instead, we thought that targeting large industrial complexes to reduce food waste for factory would be a good strategy. So that's how we adjusted strategy for go-to-market for Vietnam. And Media Plus was another startup, but we matched these company with global healthcare company and contributed to Vietnam healthcare providers' capability. So we have had joint go-to-market to Vietnam with Korean startups. So for those companies who wants to go abroad, what we do is we continuously we help these startups to carry out business in a sustainable manner, so that they develop sound strategy and then carry out business in the local market. So that's the kind of support we need.
And also regarding some challenges that we were faced with, well, I would say the outcome, because ultimately, as a private sector participant, we also want to produce an outcome of a ODA program. We are a private sector company, So we want to bring the private sector values, and we want to have that values converge with the international development organizations' values as well. So to that end, basically, as a business entity, we need to create business values to their society. So, of course, social impact is important, and other values are important as well in terms of the development assistant program. So I guess development assistant programs have their own KPIs. But as a business entity, business performance, business outcome is what we need to aim for. For example, let's say that we have some innovative solution to reduce carbon emission. Well, then the business outcome will be basically how many units did you sell, how many units of the carbon reduction equipment. So that is a business performance for that company, but also it can create environmental impact, positive environmental impact. So business KPIs need to be developed. And these KPIs should be analyzed and interpreted to evaluate the development aid program. And that should be understood by the development aid agencies. So basically, we need to develop the business KPIs based on business data, so that business companies don't have to dedicate resources to develop KPIs only for development aid program outcome. So we were going to actually talk about some pain points or improvements to be made by the government sector, but I guess we ran out of time. So hopefully we will have a future opportunity to talk about that. We have a big audience on site, and we had great presentations today. So I'd like to open up the floor for Q&A session. So any question from the audience? Okay, over here. Good morning. I'm from the Ministry of Environment. I'm responsible for ODA program. Well, rather than posing a question, I have a suggestion to make. Currently, we heard about the ODA, so nowadays the shift is towards a development effect rather than grant effect. At our ministry, we support mid-income or low-income countries rather than high-income countries. So for these countries, the recipient countries need to actually feel the effect, the positive outcome from the ODA program. So, for example, in Vietnam, currently, we have a water resource related law revision going on, so that we can bring about actual positive change to water resources in Vietnam. And we need to build the right structure to allow the participation of Korean companies. So that's actually one request that we received. And also, I've been to Indonesia, and Indonesia, the ecosystem building is an important aspect of ODA. When we look at the JICA's efforts, they try to build an automotive ecosystem in Indonesia to benefit the Japanese automotive industry, and they revised the laws and regulations to that end as well. So I believe that in Korea, for example, if our ODA program can definitely bring tangible benefits to Indonesia. So what I'm trying to say here is that from the government's perspective, we want to provide quality programs, and we want to encourage private sector companies to participate in those programs. But we see that there's a need for a platform to allow private sector participation. and it is not easy. So we need to have some kind of platform or kind of a comprehensive structure to allow private sector participation and with the public sector support. So we also need to have a structure where the risk can be shared, and also we also need to have some kind of a proven structure where the participating company can join again for a follow-up program, follow-up project. Yes, that was a really important comment. So thank you very much. Any other comment or question from the floor? Okay, if not, then we'd like to wrap up session 2 here. So public and private sectors, they have their own directions. So if they follow their own set of priorities, it may not be easy to foster cooperation. I believe that we need to have the common horizon to march forward. To that end, we need to build some kind of platform, as many participants mentioned today. Of course, public-private partnership cooperation is important, but cooperation from financial institutions is important as well. And my impression is that intermediaries are important as well, because we are talking about cooperation between public and private sector, and also cross-border collaboration as well, and for each unique program. So we need to have some kind of intermediaries, either in Korea or locally. So we definitely need a platform where diverse actors can come on and participate. So private sector, rather than approaching ODA program just as a part of their CSR activities, they can take a more proactive approach, really looking at this as a business opportunities that can coincidentally lead to more development in the recipient country as well. So with this kind of vision in mind, Korea's perhaps a procurement system and also delivery system needs to be changed, and we really need to have a partnership mindset. And I'd like to thank our co-organizers, Jipyong and the Office of Government Policy Coordination. And I also want to thank all the panelists here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once again, please give a warm hand to all the 5 discussants and our chair on the stage. So with this, we now conclude our session on revitalizing private sector engagement in development operation. With this, we now conclude today's session, organized by Office of Government Policy and sponsored by Jipyong ESG Center. I would like to thank everyone for staying with us until the end of the program. And I would also like to thank all the participants, panel discussant and presenter for giving us a direction forward. I would also like to thank viewers joining us through YouTube channel. We hope you have a safe trip home. Thank you.